Hi gaming guys, and welcome to episode 6 of SuperSports, the review series for the vehicles which are beyond your average sports car, but not quite full-on supercars. And in this episode we're featuring one of the best all-round supersports cars in the game, both in terms of sheer straight-line performance, but also all-round track ability. Now incidentally, this car is kind of underappreciated, but in one particular area it is almost completely dominant in the supersports class, so much so that it can actually take on full-on supercars, and the way in which it can do that is for sheer straight-line performance. The Esprit Sport 350, which is of course this version here, the top version of the Esprit, it's a homologation car. It has a rear wing fitted as standard, it has slightly more power, slightly less weight, well, significantly less weight than the other Esprits, and it's a much more hardcore track-focused Esprit. But for sheer straight-line performance, this is actually one of the quickest cars in the game, which is impressive for a super sports car. Now, acceleration off the line and mid-range when fully tuned can take on pretty much any other vehicle, even vehicles with far more power. There are very few vehicles on the game that can legitimately outrun the Esprit 350, and even fewer of those can actually make it look slow. There are, in fact, very, very few vehicles that can make this car look slow. It's an extremely fast supersports machine, so much so that in its fully tuned state, it has a top speed of around 297 miles per hour without NOS or draft. Now, in its fully tuned form, the specs from its 3.5 litre turbocharged engine, which is fairly obviously mid-mounted and powering, again, obviously the rear wheels, produces 950 horsepower and 647 pound-feet of torque. So significantly more power than torque, not surprisingly. And the beauty of the Esprit 350, as I mentioned earlier, is the ultra low weight for a vehicle of its power and class. It only weighs, with the full weight loss package of course, 1,064 kilos. And thanks to that ultra low weight and huge fully tuned power, the power to weight ratio on this car is a very impressive 893 horsepower per tonne, which is one of the highest of the supersports class. Now, it is moderately expensive. Now, in the supersports class, not particularly so, but for vehicles in general, it is a reasonably expensive car at 126,000 credits. But for how good it is, that's a very modest price to pay, considering how many vehicles that are much more expensive this car can easily beat, both in a straight line and around the track. Now, around the track, the handling is good, but at the same time definitely not easy, especially for beginners. I would specifically not recommend using this car fully tuned unless you have significant experience of driving hugely powerful supercars and supersports cars, because the Esprit is one of the more challenging supersports models to really get the best out of. And as I said, the handling isn't bad, it just does everything so quickly that you have to have very, very quick reflexes and an innate knowledge of what the car's going to do before it does it, in order not to end up being thrown off the track. And even then, the car will still surprise you sometimes, which is fun. It makes the car very enjoyable to drive, but obviously it's not ideal for racing. You want a car that is dependable. Now, that said, the sheer overwhelming speed of this car does make it very, very good for track racing. And the PP, when fully tuned, is a pretty high 638 PP, at which you can get some pretty serious track cars at that PP level. But the Esprit, on selected tracks, can still punch well above its weight, both in terms of literally its weight and also its power bracket. Because at the end of the day, there are plenty of vehicles with significantly more power than the Esprit that are fully fledged racing machines that are still not as fast as this car. Now, as far as track racing, I would not recommend fully tuning it, because as awesome as it would seem to have a 297 mile per hour track car, you can't really use all that performance on the majority of tracks. There's only pretty much 2 tracks that you can use that kind of speed on, and they are of course Le Mans and Special Stage Route X. Anywhere else and you're not going to get anywhere near 300 miles per hour. The Nürburgring Straight perhaps, but for the rest of the track you just don't need that amount of power in a road car. So if you plan on using this car for track use, I would recommend being a bit more restrained in your tuning levels. Make it as light as you want, because obviously that is a great advantage of this car, but as far as power, be very careful how much power you put into this car, because it can cope with it, but you might not be able to. And even for a more seasoned driver, the Esprit is a more challenging model than many other cars with similar power, such as the Mercedes SLS, for instance, which is a much more forgiving car to drive. The Esprit is certainly an extremely fast machine, but with 950 horsepower, you're pretty much wrestling against the car all the time. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes that, by all means do it. The car can certainly cope with the power. But if you are less experienced with driving cars that have around 900 horsepower per tonne, it's a little bit of a challenge to get the best out of that performance. And although you may not necessarily be crashing on every corner, you won't really be getting the best out of that 950 horsepower engine. And to be honest, the Esprit is so quick that even if you leave it at, say, 500 or 600 horsepower, it's still an overwhelmingly fast car for its PP. So if you haven't bought this particular Esprit, I would strongly recommend that you do so, because it's one of the quickest cars in the game and one of the best all round in terms of competitiveness. So that's it for this review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.